Imagine a scene where right in front of your eyes, your own friends are drowning alive in mud. Their 60-pound steel armor dragging them under the water. And they're suffocating to death in mud mixed with their own blood and piss. Now imagine that your grandfather already told you this would happen. He warned you. You had 70 years of written manuals that explained in detail that this was a suicide mission. And yet here you are, standing in the exact same spot, making the exact same mistake, running toward your own death. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of October 25, 1415, when 25,000 French knights repeated the exact same fatal error that had already killed 10,000 French nobles 70 years earlier. And this time, their deaths were even more humiliating and agonizing. This is the story of two battles, so similar it feels like someone copy-pasted a nightmare. The first battle was Crécy in 1346, where French knights first learned what English longbowmen's arrows could do. The second battle was Agincourt in 1415, where French knights proved that humans learn nothing from history, no matter how many corpses warn them. But this isn't just a story of tactical blunders. This is a psychological horror story, where pride, arrogance, and false honor drowned an entire generation in mud. Everything started at Crécy. In August 1346, English King Edward III invaded France with his small army. French King Philip VI thought this would be an easy victory. He had triple the soldiers, the best armored knights, and most importantly, he had home field advantage. But when the battle happened, the French knights made a mistake that would never be forgotten in history. They shoved their own Genoese crossbowmen to the back of the battlefield because they thought it was dishonorable to take help from peasant archers. For French nobility, war was a game, a chance for personal glory, not a matter of strategy. When the English longbowmen started firing arrows, chaos erupted. The Genoese crossbowmen had been slowed by the rain, and their bowstrings had gotten wet. They started to retreat. The French knights saw this as cowardice. Some accounts say the French knights actually hacked down their own retreating crossbowmen, considering them traitors. Then they charged, in full armor, across muddy ground, straight into a rain of English arrows. What happened over the next 6 hours was one of the bloodiest slaughters in medieval warfare history. English longbowmen were firing 12 arrows per minute. Imagine 5,000 archers, each firing 12 arrows per minute. That means 60,000 arrows every single minute raining down on French knights. Horses were torn apart by arrows. Knights were crushed beneath them. The knights who survived and made it to the English lines were so exhausted they could barely fight. In the end, 10,000 French soldiers died, including almost the entire French nobility. The English lost only 100 to 300 men. It was a humiliating defeat. Survivors told stories to their children. They gave warnings. Military manuals were written. Everyone knew that charging English longbowmen through muddy terrain was suicide. Then 70 years later, in October 1415, history repeated itself. But this time in an even more brutal way. English King Henry V invaded France, but his army was a disaster. He had come with 12,000 soldiers, but dysentery and the siege had cut his army in half. By October, he only had 6,000 soldiers left, most of them sick, starving, and dying. Henry's plan was to quickly reach Calais port and run back to England before winter. But the French army blocked every bridge. Henry's army kept marching through muddy fields, in the rain without food. Soldiers were dying from dysentery. Chronicles describe how liquid shit was continuously running down English soldiers' legs. Some soldiers were so weak they couldn't control their bowels. Many had removed their pants because their clothes had rotted from the feces. They were marching half naked, starving, dying. This wasn't a conquering army. This was a death march. Then on October 24th, the French army cornered them near Agincourt. French nobles were celebrating that night. They were getting drunk, gambling on who would capture Henry V. Some were already designing cages for prisoners. They had complete confidence. They had 25,000 fresh, well-fed, fully armored knights. The English had 6,000 half-dead soldiers. The odds were insanely in French favor. But French commanders held a meeting and decided on their strategy. Marshal Boucicaut, who was smart, said to use crossbowmen first, send cavalry from the flanks, wait for the English to advance. It was a sensible plan. But French nobles rejected him, calling him a coward. Their final plan was walk straight at them until we win. Literally, no flanking, no archery support, no strategy, just pure arrogant suicidal charge, exactly like Crécy. Except this time they knew what had happened at Crécy. They ignored the warnings. They ignored the history lessons. They ignored common sense. Because their honor demanded that they not take help from peasants. October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, the battle began. The battlefield was a narrow, muddy corridor, 1,000 yards wide, limited by woods on both sides. Recent plowing and October rain had converted the ground into thick clay. The English positioned themselves at the narrowest point. 5,000 longbowmen on the wings, protected by sharpened wooden stakes. The French had to funnel into this killing zone. There was no escape. Young French knights argued to wait, starve out the English, find better ground. But senior nobles talked about honor. They ordered an immediate attack. The French had learned one wrong lesson from Crécy. They thought the problem was that there weren't enough men at Crécy. So they arranged their 25,000 soldiers into 3 massive divisions, one behind the other, with hardly any space between them. The first division alone had 8,000 men, at arms, dismounted because they had learned horses were vulnerable. But they were so tightly packed, they could barely swing their weapons. The second division had 8,000 more. The third had 9,000. They had literally designed a human-crushing machine, with themselves as the victims. Before the battle, the French sent cavalry wings, around 1,200 mounted knights, to scatter the English archers. The plan was simple. Gallop through the peasants, scatter them, wheel around, hit the English from behind. Cavalry commanders had checked the ground the previous night and reported it was too soft for horses. They were ordered to charge anyway. When the cavalry charged, disaster immediately began. Horses started sinking into the mud. What should have been a thundering charge became a slow, motion stumble. With each step, horses were pulling their hooves from the mud. The English archers calmly started shooting. They had seen this speed before at Crécy. 12 arrows per minute per archer. 5,000 archers meant 60,000 arrows per minute. The arrow storm started hitting the cavalry from 200 yards away. Horses screaming, arrows in their chests, legs, faces. Knights fell into the mud in full armor. Those coming from behind crashed into them. Some horses, maddened by arrows, threw off their riders and ran back toward French lines, creating chaos in the advancing infantry. The cavalry that reached the English archers found sharpened stakes waiting. Horses impaled themselves. Knights were thrown. English archers shot at point-blank range. Within 10 minutes, Both cavalry wings were destroyed. They accomplished nothing except filling the narrow battlefield with screaming horses and floundering knights. Then the main French advance began. 8,000 dismounted knights, in 60 pounds of armor, had to walk 300 yards through mud that came up to their knees. Each step required enormous effort. Their sabaton foot armor was getting stuck in the mud. After 50 yards they were exhausted. After 100 yards they were gasping for breath inside their closed helmets. The neat lines dissolved. Some fell face first into the mud and couldn't get up. They literally drowned wearing fortunes in steel, even before reaching arrow range. English archers watched this slow motion disaster approaching and couldn't believe their luck. At 250 yards, the English longbowmen began their work. Just like at Crécy, thousands of arrows darkened the October sky. But this time, the French couldn't even run forward into the storm. The mud held them in place like targets at practice. Arrows found every gap in their armor. Armpits when arms were raised, eye slits in helmets, groins where plates met. French knights held shields over their heads for protection, but this forced them to lean forward, making walking even harder. Knights who fell with arrow wounds couldn't get up. Their companions stepped on them, pushing them deeper into the mud. 5,000 English archers were drawing and loosing 12 arrows per minute. That meant 60,000 arrows per minute, falling on French knights, who were barely moving forward. The French 1st Division kept advancing through the arrow storm, because stopping meant certain death, and advancing meant possible glory. Knights with 3 or 4 arrows stuck in their armor kept walking. Men with arrows through their arms still gripped their weapons. Some had arrows lodged in the eye slits of their helmets, blinded but still stumbling forward, because their companions pushed from behind. The mud was turning red with French blood. Men were slipping on the bodies of those who had fallen ahead of them. By the time the first French knights reached the English lines, they had been walking for 20 minutes through knee-deep mud, while being continuously shot. They were so exhausted that some simply stopped at the English line, too tired to even raise their weapons. They just waited to be killed. These were France's finest knights, men who had trained for war since childhood, and they arrived at the fight already defeated by mud and arrows. When the French finally closed to fighting range, the battlefield's narrow width created a catastrophe worse than anything at Crécy. The 8,000 men of the 1st Division were compressed into a front of maybe 400 yards. Men were pressed together so tightly they couldn't raise their weapons. The wings, trying to avoid the arrow storm, pushed toward the center. Knights were literally crushing each other to death before they even reached the English lines. When they finally made contact with the English men at arms, they were so exhausted from the mud march and so compressed together they could barely fight. The English, fresh and on solid ground they had prepared, simply had to thrust spears into the mass of French bodies pressed against them. It was less a battle than industrial slaughter. Exactly like Crécy, but somehow even more pathetic. Within 30 minutes of contact, the 1st French Division was destroyed. But instead of retreating, the 2nd Division pushed forward into the same killing zone, climbing over the bodies of the 1st. Dead and wounded French knights were piling up in front of the English lines, creating literal walls of corpses 3 and 4 bodies high. The English men at arms used these corpse walls as defensive positions, stabbing down at Frenchmen trying to climb over their dead companions. Some French knights made it to the top of these body piles, only to be shoved backward, falling into the mass of wounded men below, who pulled them down and drowned them in mud and blood. The narrow battlefield meant there was nowhere for the French to go except forward into English weapons or backward into their own advancing troops. They were trapped in a slaughterhouse of their own making. The compression in the French ranks became so extreme that men began dying without being struck. Knights in the middle of the press couldn't move their arms, couldn't fall down, couldn't even breathe properly. They stood upright, held in place by the bodies around them, slowly suffocating inside their helmets, as others pushed from behind. Some had their chest plates crushed inward by the pressure, ribs breaking, lungs collapsing. Men were dying standing up, dead on their feet but unable to fall. When the pressure finally released, dozens of knights would collapse at once, revealing they had been dead for minutes. It was a uniquely medieval horror, being crushed to death by your own allies, while wearing armor designed to protect you. The English didn't even need to kill these men. The French formation was murdering itself. In the midst of this disaster, the Duke of Alençon, one of France's greatest warriors, somehow fought his way through the chaos to reach Henry V himself. With a handful of knights, he had carved through English men at arms, driven by the insane courage that French nobility mistook for tactics. He actually struck Henry's crown with his sword, denting the gold, coming within inches of killing the English king. For a moment it looked like the French might snatch victory from catastrophe through sheer individual heroism. Then English guards swarmed Alençon, pulling him down, stabbing him through the gaps in his armor. He died at Henry's feet. The last French noble to come close to changing the battle's outcome. His death proved what the entire battle had demonstrated. Individual French courage was magnificent and completely useless against coordinated English tactics. As the French attack stalled and dissolved into chaos, the English archers dropped their bows and grabbed mallets, axes, and daggers. These were peasants and yeomen, men who normally would never dare approach a knight, now wading into a sea of helpless French nobility stuck in the mud. They worked methodically, smashing open helmets with mallets, driving daggers through eye slits, slitting throats of men too exhausted to resist. Some archers became incredibly wealthy in minutes, stripping rings and jeweled belts from nobles worth thousands of pounds in ransom. Knights who at the battle's start had joked about capturing Henry V were now begging English peasants for mercy, offering ransoms that would feed a village for years. The archers mostly ignored the pleas. There were too many French knights to take prisoner, and killing was easier than guarding. The French 3rd Division, 9,000 strong and still fresh, watched this massacre from 200 yards away. They had a clear view of their companions drowning in mud, being crushed to death, clubbed down by peasant archers. They could have charged, could have tried to save their countrymen, could have at least died with honor. Instead, after 2 hours of watching the slaughter, they turned and left the battlefield. They simply walked away, leaving the 1st and 2nd Divisions to die without help. It was the ultimate proof that French nobles cared more about their own survival than their comrades. The few knights from the first 2 divisions who escaped the killing zone looked back and saw their supposed rescuers abandoning them. Some chroniclers say those survivors died of shame before they died of wounds. By mid-afternoon, the English had captured more French prisoners than they had soldiers. Hundreds of wealthy French nobles sat in groups behind English lines, guarded by just a few men. Then scouts reported that the French 3rd Division might be regrouping for another attack. Henry V faced a brutal calculation. If the French attacked again, the prisoners would be freed and would fight from behind English lines. The English would be surrounded and destroyed. So Henry gave an order that stained his victory. Kill all the prisoners. English men at arms refused at first. Murdering unarmed nobles who had surrendered violated every law of chivalry and cost them fortunes in ransom. So Henry ordered his archers to do it. These peasants, who had just become rich beyond their dreams, were forced to murder their wealth. They herded French nobles into barns and set them on fire. They clubbed men who had surrendered in good faith. Over 1,000 French prisoners were massacred in cold blood, turning a military victory into a war crime. When the killing finally stopped around 4 p.m., the battlefield looked like a vision of hell. French bodies were piled so high, in some places they blocked the view across the field. English heralds counted between 7,000 and 10,000 French dead, including most of France's military leadership. 3 dukes, 90 counts and barons, 1,500 knights. The entire military aristocracy of France lay dead in the mud. The English lost fewer than 500 men, most of them in the initial arrow exchange. It was a massacre ratio even worse than Crécy. A complete vindication of English longbow tactics, and absolute proof that French nobles had learned nothing in 70 years. The battlefield was so choked with corpses that locals spent 3 days burning bodies, and the smell carried for miles. The worst part of Agincourt wasn't the death count or the tactical disaster. It was the fact that French nobility had every opportunity to avoid it and chose glory over survival anyway. They had 70 years of warnings. They had written accounts of Crécy. They had the numerical advantage, better equipment, fresh troops against dying enemies. All they had to do was nothing. Wait out the English, let starvation finish Henry's army, or force battle on better ground. Instead, they charged into the same trap their grandfathers had died in, made the same mistakes, ignored the same advice, and died in the same mud. It proved that French military culture valued personal honor over victory, individual glory over collective success, and dying nobly over winning intelligently. And incredibly, the French nobility still hadn't learned their lesson. They would lose battles the same way for another 100 years, until Joan of Arc finally taught them that peasants with weapons could actually win wars, if you let them fight smart, instead of making them die prettily. This story isn't just about 2 battles. It's a warning about how arrogance, pride, and false honor can destroy entire generations. When you consider your ego more important than your strategy, when you ignore history's warnings, because honor demands it, then you're sending your soldiers to slaughter. French knights didn't die at Agincourt because they weren't brave. They died because they were stupid, arrogant, and believed their noble birth placed them above tactics. They didn't learn because learning seemed weak to them. And as a result, thousands died exactly the way their grandfathers had died, in the same mud, from the same arrows, with the same stupidity.